right.
This weekend, children.
We gotta get started. It is not almost 5 after, but it is time to get rolling. So, first things first, I just need to do the air. I have not RBF, but this thing signed to sinus space today. So if I look like I'm in a bad mood, everything's actually kind of fine. Like you guys haven't done anything wrong. Just gonna, not harsh the mellow for this morning at 10 a.m. So everything's going fine. If you are planning on coming on summer camp with me for rec, we're heading out west. I'm going to have a series of basically the same meeting or whatever. Anytime this afternoon that you can, we're going to go over stuff like gear, menu. There's some things you definitely want to take to eat on summer camp and some things that are best left behind and so forth. We'll also talk about kind of any questions that you have in more specific detail pursuant to things like 420 and which states are legalization states out west and which are not. It's important to be situationally aware as a forester. So consuming legalized marijuana products in some states, but on federal property because it's still a DEA listed molecule or pair of molecules, that can be a problem. So we just want to, be responsible, grown-up, informed adults and make good choices. And that's kind of where we leave it. So we'll talk through stuff like that at that level. Not just, hey, you need a backpack for summer camp, field work, but also stuff like how to start packing it so that you don't hurt your back, how to physically put a loaded pack on so you don't blow out your discs in your spine and so forth. And just kind of get into some of the more nitty-gritty details so that, to the extent possible at least, with rec camp we can kind of hit the ground running. We have a packed schedule this year. It's going to be awesome. But it does necessitate we get some preparation in place. So these meetings are designed to help you do exactly that and come with any questions that you have at any one of these time slots kind of throughout. So if you have class from 12 to 2 or something like that, no big deal. We'll just see you 3 or 4. Yeah?
We're not in the classroom today for 187, so you're open the whole thing.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, so I'll catch people in the hallway and then we'll pull them into the room.
Yeah, we're going to wood shop.
I think the Soils Judging Club uses that classroom at some point in the afternoon. So at that point we'll move into the reading room, whatever, it doesn't matter. But yeah, so I'll see you in that meeting, any one of those meetings. And again, I'll try to record them, like I said in the email out to everybody yesterday, so that if you really can't make it, it's super boring watching a video of a meeting, but the content's actually pretty good and important. So yeah, it's our first chance to start going over stuff like how do we deal with lightning storms and rain out west, a different proposition than they are here. Are we actually going to deal with rattlesnakes and bear encounters and irate mountain goats and stuff like that? Yes. Okay, how do we deal with those things when we encounter them? Because it's not a question of that. And it's fine. Like, this is the kind of stuff that foresters deal with in the field all day, every day. But, for those of us who grew up as flatlanders here in the Midwest, and we're not really accustomed to ordering our meal plans around things like bears, it's just kind of a mindset shift. Okay? So, come on to any of these meetings, bring your questions, bring a friend, and we'll get through some good stuff. Stay as long as you can, or head out as you need to for your next class. No big deal. Are there any questions about either summer camp before we jump back into history stuff for today, since it's a little bit cold and wet outside? Okay. In that case, let's get back into the history. So just as a refresher, we've paused for about a week straight on talking through kind of the ancient history, the ancient social history that is focusing on the 99% versus the 1%, the pharaohs, the kings, the emperors, the kings and queens, and so forth. How did everybody else encounter leisure, or did they encounter leisure in any sense similar to what we have? This is going to help us explain and understand why we do park rangering the way that we do these days. Okay.
In the meantime, we paused for a planning exercise out by Campus Lake, and that was a two-parter, so a Thursday and Tuesday of last week and this week. We had a chance to kind of work through an outdoor and indoor section of that. Now let's get back to kind of wrapping up this sense of the ancient world. So as a brief reminder, we started with kind of ancient Mesopotamia and some semi-permanent early settlements, maybe just religious ritual centers like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. And from there, we got through like the pharaohs and ancient Egypt and so forth, up to the point of ancient Greece. So we're mostly working in the kind of 2 to 3000 BC or BCE era up to about 500 AD or CE era in this particular chunk. So what's going on kind of towards the end of this sense of the ancient Greek kind of city-state time period and location is a sense of different schools of philosophy kind of ordering a savage, unsafe, high child mortality world mentally or intellectually. The study of how to file things under good or bad, safe or not safe, desirable, not desirable, we call that epistemology. And the ancient Greek philosophers were some of the first epistemologists, kind of focusing or filing things on difficult questions like, okay, so if we don't spend 24 hours a day farming and building mud hovel huts, and we have any sense of time other than that, discretionary time, what do we do with that? Do we plow it into more work? Like literally plow it into more work? Do we do relaxing things? Do we do hard things with kind of a thin coat of paint of fun over top of them to develop people for military pursuits, like the Olympic Games and so forth? Or do we pursue pleasure for pleasure's sake, as in this case the hedonists did? So, lots of different genuinely competing schools of thought. And some of these were kind of mainline, like, public messaging kind of schools of thought, and others were pretty radical. Punk AF in the ancient world. So fast forwarding a little bit to some cultures that followed the ancient Greeks and really sort of lifted a lot from ancient Greek thought. In particular, the Romans, of course. Basically, we'd say these days that they appropriated Greek culture and thought and, in large part, religion. And just kind of papered over things with a new set of names, but kind of the same ideas. The Romans were, maybe they were intellectually a little bit lazier, or they just recognized that the Greeks had some pretty useful ideas and kind of took them and made them their own. So, in Roman culture, as in Greek culture, we have this sense of enslaved people being a huge chunk of the literal labor force, providing essentially horsepower or watts of energy to do things like all of the different kinds of work. And slavery back then was sort of a different sense than we have in our recent national history. It was something you could enter into, kind of like an unpaid internship today. You could sign your freedom over, and for a set or defined amount of time, or for a set task, be a slave, or just get enslaved forcibly or compulsorily as a punishment for something, or as a conquered nation or tribe, that kind of a thing. The Greeks, and as refined by the Romans, really ran things this way, and that intensive human labor freed up everybody above that tier or layer or slab in society for a little bit more stuff that looks like a little bit closer to modern day leisure pursuits and indeed forest and outdoor recreation. Okay? So, the concept of wealth evolves dramatically throughout this time, and surplus wealth is one factor that's kind of maybe pretty important or necessary for understanding how different cultures do and for comparing across cultures and so forth. So some societies in the ancient kind of larger extended Mediterranean world, so Northern Africa, Asia Minor, Southern Europe, or what will become Southern Europe, some of them take a fairly neutral stance towards wealth. Money is useful for exchange towards goods and services, but it's not really, at least on an official party line across a society, right? Every individual's a little bit different. It's not necessarily good or bad. It's just a way to sort of make things happen. One Roman sense of how to do, what leisure, what recreation, what life looked like was a little bit like the sort of 1950s American dream of, work with a company your entire life, retire with a pension, and enjoy life. So part of working in the Roman army, for example, signing on and gaining citizenship that way, because the Romans sort of opened up citizenship to a lot more folks than other ancient cultures did. And so a lot more folks were able to take advantage of the Pax Romana, that is, the peace enforced by the projection of Roman military presence all around the ancient Western world at the time. So as far north and west as like southern Scotland, the region that they called Germania, that we would call Northern Europe these days, as far east as some of these older ancient cultures and so forth. The Eastern Roman Empire is going to become the Byzantine Empire and so forth. All of this is happening under the boot of Roman legions, and they were sort of unapologetically expansionist, and so they'd project force, take over huge chunks of land, entire countries worth of space in these big military campaigns. Legions would be out for 10, 15 years, just sort of progressively marching farther and farther, and conquering folks, and then hooking those distant places up through the network of Roman roads to have some of the surplus production of these places, and importing Roman Mediterranean-style farming techniques and so forth. Some of that excess food, some of that excess fiber, so plant materials for making textiles and that sort of thing, starts flowing back towards Rome. So everybody who's not in the slave level of society, and everybody who's not at the moment busy with war fighting and empire expansion activities, they have some sense of surplus wealth. And so pursuing leisure, pursuing forced and outdoor recreation is kind of a part of that. Once you retired from active duty military, typically part of your retirement package, so to speak, was a chunk of land, a villa, so like a nice big house, comparatively speaking, a big house for them at that time. They'd be, in a lot of cases, fairly quaint by our standards today, but you march around to beautiful places, you meet interesting people, you slaughter them as part of the Roman military, and then part of that land is given back to you as a centurion, an officer over 100 troops, and you have this sort of farmstead retirement, typically with servants and or slaves, to sort of run farm ops, and you get to relax and enjoy while folks sort of take care of you. Okay? So this was a big deal. Like, a lot of people saw that, and they were like, well, I could work on my own and die after a nasty, brutish, and short life, or I can sign on here, and the benefits, the bennies, that gummint cheese, is pretty good. And so a lot of people do. And on this basis, the Roman Empire just grows like a weed, out to the point that the borders get so big that a bunch of subjugated folks like the Goths, their resentment at being conquered and having their wealth extracted towards Rome and so forth, gets so bad, the internal political strife of basically bored politicians in Rome, squabbling and undergoing power struggles, it causes the Roman Empire to collapse under the weight of its own sort of inertia, its own upkeep cost. With all of its armies way far out, when Rome itself is attacked and burned in a series of attacks by Goths, it starts this sort of 1,000-year process, literally 1,000 years of the Roman Empire turning into Byzantine Empire and the Holy Roman Empire, and then just sort of collapsing into a bunch of individual countries. Okay? But to give you a sense of how big and how influential Roman culture was across the world, you're familiar with the term Caesar, right? Okay, so yeah, so in Rome around the year 0, around the year 100, and so forth, the empire was so big that it was broken up. It was like the equivalent of them having a couple, 3, 4, or 2, typically, presidents, if you want to think of it that way. Like if America was so big, we had to have a couple of presidents to run it. Those were called Augusti, and beneath those, their sort of lieutenants were the Caesars. And so if you're familiar with Julius Caesar and so forth, that's kind of the level at which that is happening. So when we break in, split, fracture into the Byzantine Empire and what will later become the Holy Roman Empire, kind of the Western Europe side of what was the Roman Empire, this idea, this pattern for running society and flowing resources toward leisure pursuits and so forth, we have all the way over in Russia, which the Russian Federation, the Soviet Socialist Republic back in the day, Russia spanned 12 time zones, like it's a big place. And the leader of Russia was called a Tsar, from Caesar. And leaders in places like Germany, which is not at all culturally like Russia, they called their leader a Kaiser, after Caesar. And the Germanians, Northern European tribes, fucking hated the Roman Empire. So for the Romans to leave an indelible mark on societies that would later become like modern-day Germany and so forth, 2,000 years later, to have your leader called essentially a Caesar, that's a pretty strong echo through a very long time. So this is a big deal. The way that the Romans kind of oriented towards work hard, fight hard, play hard is going to echo forward through time. And we're going to see some echoes of that even today. Okay? And then some more religiously focused communities saw, right, the Mediterranean is the cradle of the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity in no particular order. And these tended to see, because these were cultures that were not conquerors, while the Muslims conquered most of the Mediterranean, but much, much later. Because these more religiously focused cultures tended not to be outward focused conquerors, but more inwardly focused conquered peoples, they tended to kind of respond or maybe even react in an opposing way to the sense of Roman Wayne's World, party time, excellence. It was seen as excess. It was seen as evil. It was seen as sin. Because if you are one of the enslaved nations working your butt off to power this Roman party machine, doesn't seem like a pretty good deal to you. Make sense? So even 2,000 years ago, we're starting to get this sense of, okay, there are legitimate and legitimately opposing senses of, is going for a walk in the woods a great thing, an okay thing, or a really bad, maybe even irredeemable thing? Like, this could cause people to fall into sin, okay? So, let's briefly look across a couple other cultures along the way. So just as a reminder, we talked that way back when Mansa Musa in sub-Saharan Africa, one of the richest human beings on Earth, if not the richest by a lot, a trillionaire in today's dollars, right? So Elon Musk, personal wealth of, I don't know, $200 billion. Mansa Musa is like, get on my level, you filthy pleb, all right? But in some other cultures across the world that are developing without necessarily the same kinds of mineral metal resources like iron, high-quality iron ore is difficult to come across in places like Japan. So we see a lot more cultural artifacts and so forth based on a slightly different cultural emphasis. Okay. Japan has its castles at this time, and certainly will develop into some fairly sophisticated castles with things like false floors and anti-earthquake installations inside of them, so these 5 or 6 story tall wooden castles don't completely explode into a pile of confetti and matchsticks during tectonic events. Pretty cool stuff. This is the end of the planet that is going to be a little bit more focused on stuff like later on Buddhism and very ancient cultural traditions of Shinto. So the sense here is that instead of a monotheistic Abrahamic God that has created all of the universe and everything in it and is sort of master of this huge battle of good versus evil, appropriate to talk about during Easter week, right? The sense in Eastern cultures is, in some senses, kind of the opposite. So there are a couple of different, structurally different versions of Buddhism and stuff like that. Shinto as a traditional animistic religious understanding of the world and how everything fits together, has people thinking about nature, interacting with nature, thinking about stuff like leisure in a very, very different way than this Greco-Roman sense of hedonism or Epicureanism or Stoicism. It's like we need to pair with the land. We need to live in and be present with the dynamics of our landscape, because everything, literally everything, every single plant, every rock, every mountain, every stream has a real spirit associated with it. And if you piss off one of those, you run the risk of pissing off all other friends too, and that's not going to go well for you. So, the sense of recreation and leisure in Southeast Asian and East Asian cultures, mainland China, Taiwan, what will later become Vietnam, what will later become the Korean Peninsula and so forth. There's this sense, typically across many of them, that we are much more integrated with our landscape. We are not surviving despite it, which will become, as we'll see later, a much more sort of American and Christian sense of how to understand the land around us. Okay? So, we got to understand that not everybody is coming from the same cultural background that we are. My wife, her family is first-generation immigrant family from Japan to the United States in the late 1970s. My wife was born in Japan and came over here about 3 months later as a tiny little baby. And she is American as apple pie, and her parents think about things like camping pretty differently than I do. In fact, they don't think about camping at all, like ever. that's not something that most folks have a strong cultural emphasis on in the same way that we do here in the United States these days. So it's super important for us as future park rangers, future conservation police officers, and so forth, not to paint everybody with the same brush. When we're making a presence patrol or contacting somebody for an environmental interpretation hike, leading them on a guided hike, something like that, or trying to design things like trail networks. Do we want to cater to a quintessentially American backpacking experience? Or do we want kind of a more European style, let's hike from mountain chalet to mountain chalet, and we had wine and cheese for breakfast, let's have wine and cheese for lunch, and we'll carry these little day packs because we're not carrying tents like those filthy savage Americans, okay? There are lots of different ways to answer questions of how then shall we live? With, of course, an outdoor recreation answers to those things. So, back to Japan. In the same way that we have the Olympic Games, which are a proxy or a model based on warfighting and so forth, we have the same kind of ritualization in Southeast Asia. We saw on an earlier slide this sense of ancient China having horsemanship competitions. Can you ride and hang on to a galloping horse with just your legs so that you can draw and fire a short bow? That seems like a pretty cool thing. So in the same way that we have like timber sports competitions today with Conclave and lumberjack shows in places like Upper Peninsula, Michigan and so forth, that people pay money to watch people chopping stuff as fast as they can and run up telephone poles with spikes on their boots and stuff like that. Other cultures are doing this same kind of a thing. And so one of Japan's senses of this is this idea of sumo and kind of like pro wrestling these days. But if you've ever, has anybody ever actually watched a real sumo match?
I've been to Japan, seen it. It's awesome.
Yeah, it's different.
TV, but not.
They're betting like crazy. There's a lot of cigarette smoking here.
Yes. There's a ton of betting. There's before and after each match, a Shinto priest walks kind of a mobile shrine and all of this sort of religious stuff and kind of circle around and kind of like blesses the match. I mean, can you imagine a WWE match with like a priest swinging a censer, that thing that holds the smoky incense and stuff like that? So in other cultures, things aren't as compartmentalized. This kind of stuff has been around so long that it's acquired an official religious presence for something as fun as a sumo match. Watching two very, very large guys, like squat, and they have these little skirts of like beads and very specific hairdos, and it's this whole ritual. They grab a handful of rice, they throw it into the ring to have the blessing originally of the sort of the minor deities associated with that for this wrestling match. Okay? So every possible combination or separation of things like religion and recreation is present somewhere across the face of the planet. And here in the United States, I think we tend to have this this sense of American exceptionalism. Like, all of the things, all of the ways that we could do, we got those questions answered a little bit better than everybody else, because America, F yeah. And it's, it's awesome being American. Like, the view from up here is pretty good, but it's not the only way. And so, to the extent that we have international visitors and so forth, when you're park rangering, you want to just be aware of and open and accommodating to other ways of knowing, other senses of how things go, how things should be, how folks think about the value or the dangers of forest and outdoor recreation. All right, let's stop there.